Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Michele Holt-Shannon. I direct New Hampshire Listens at the Carsey School of Public Policy. And I'm here with Dan Bromberg and Michael Ettlinger. And we're going to talk about what is going on with the Carsey School these days and just check in on all of our work. Michael, let's start with you. What is your job and what were you doing before you came to the Carsey School?
So I am the director of the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Before I became the director of the Carsey School about 5 years ago, a long time ago, I worked in the New York State Legislature for a couple of years at the beginning of my career. But most of my career has been in Washington, D.C., working for various think tanks and advocacy groups. So I worked at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, where I was the director of tax policy. I worked at Public Campaign, which is a campaign finance organization. I worked at the Economic Policy Institute. I ran the economics team at the Center for American Progress, where I worked for John Podesta, who'd been President Clinton's chief of staff and ran the Obama transition and did other things. Then I was at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where I was the director of economic and fiscal portfolio. Then I came to Carsey, and I did take a little break where I was the director of economic policy planning for the Clinton-Kaine transition, which of course ended on election day of 2016. And then I'm back here at Carsey since then, directing the Carsey School of Public Policy.
So a ton of policy experience. Tell us about the Carsey School, especially for folks who don't think of themselves as policy wonks. What's the Carsey School about?
Yeah, I mean, we're the School of Public Policy at the state's flagship university. We're well recognized nationally for our research, for our master's degree programs in public policy, and I think Dan's going to talk about that in a minute. And we do a lot of work trying to convene people, just to get people together to talk about how to address policy challenges and to actually take steps towards that.
Well, so say a little more about what the Carsey School actually does.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would just say overall is that we're very focused on being practical. So the most obvious example of that is a lot of places in academia do research, but we're very focused on our research being actionable research that people can take and do something with to make some positive change for society. And that's a real hallmark for us. And we have, talking about research, we have leading experts in a number of areas. And we do have 3 master degree programs, which I mentioned. And again, our students, it's very important to us that our students learn skills so that they can hit the ground running in careers to be impactful. And we have scholars teaching classes, but we also have leading practitioners teaching classes. Again, very much focused on our work being practical and actionable. And then we engage in communities. We advise policymakers on things, and we can do public discussions in a variety of ways. And one thing I'll just highlight for a second is that while we engage on a lot of areas nationally and on the national scene, one program we have that we're particularly proud of is New Hampshire Listens, which you mentioned you direct. And it's very focused on the state of New Hampshire, but also offers a pilot for other states and communities around the country on how to do the kind of work it does. But rather than me doing an inadequate explanation of what it does and getting into it, maybe I'll kick it back to you, Michele, to talk about that a bit.
Sounds good. Well, New Hampshire Listens is actually 10 years old this month. So
congratulations. Happy birthday.
It's time. Thank you. We are really focused on helping schools and communities and organizations bring people together and increase the engagement in the work that they do, and help people work together to make their communities, work for everyone. So a lot about participation, helping people be a part of the decisions that impact their lives. And We use a lot of different tools for that. Dialogue is a primary tool that we utilize. We do learning exchanges to help people sort of break down the silos that stop them from working with each other, and essentially, most of our work from there is customized to the organization that we work with, and we've addressed issues everywhere from a dangerous intersection to responding to controversy and racist incidents. So, really, all kinds of things that impact communities and public life.
Could you take, I've been particularly impressed how you pivoted your work in light of the COVID-19 crisis. Could you talk a little bit about what you've been doing in that area?
Yeah, I think we're mostly known for what we do in person, but the values and the principles that we work with absolutely apply online as well. And so we've hosted several roundtables in the last uh, now couple of months to help people, think mindfully about the kind of spaces they're creating with on video. And the charitable foundation has supported us in just getting those out there for free. So several hundred people have joined those. One of the ones that we've been um, thinking a lot about is having people anticipate what will reopening be like. And so that's one of the roundtables that we've been hosting. And coming up, we'll do a few on talking to people across political differences because many of us struggle with that, including myself.
Um, it's hard in this format to really capture the full breadth of the kind of work any of our programs do, but I think it's particularly true of New Hampshire Listens. One thing that's a little different than what you just described is the work you've done on childhood lead poisoning, and maybe you could tell people what you did in that space.
When you started with just talking about all of your policy work and the range of policy work in the Carsey School and being practical, we've done work sort of on the back end of policy. So a policy change has already been made, and we work with communities to adapt to that. And childhood lead poisoning was one of those because New Hampshire just voted in mandatory testing for kids under 2, and they voted in mandatory testing for schools and early childhood centers. And so there were a lot of folks, really a lot of individuals isolated in towns who needed to address those issues. And so we brought people together across 7 communities just to learn more about lead poisoning and think about strategies for implementing those tests and then responding to those tests. So that was a really interesting one, and public health networks and state folks were involved, and oddly enough, something that often feels like it's one more thing on the plate that feels very overwhelming, like childhood lead poisoning. When people got together, they felt a little more energized to make some of the changes that needed to be made. The front end piece is an example right now is we're supporting the Commission on School Funding in New Hampshire, and so hopefully that will lead to policy change that gets developed. And so we're doing engagement around that to really get a broad sense of where folks are in New Hampshire about making those changes. So that's kind of 2 sides of that policy piece.
Yeah, that's terrific work as well. You'd mentioned your work on some tough issues around race and equity, and I know you've been doing work with the New Hampshire Endowment for Health, and I've been to a couple of those. They're big statewide convenings, I know, and why don't you say something about our involvement in that?
The Endowment for Health is really leading work in New Hampshire across multiple sectors around paying attention to race and equity. And we've been staffing the support team to design the meetings and gatherings to support and train facilitators working with work groups, and to help create the space where people can participate. There's education, economic development, civic engagement, law enforcement, criminal justice, health. I'm forgetting one right now, but it's pretty comprehensive work. It's now a couple of years in, and we basically are supporting the work groups that are making plans and starting to implement to impact all those sectors when it comes to race and equity in New Hampshire.
It's great. Yeah, we could do a whole thing, and maybe we will on New Hampshire Listens, because it's very, fascinating, productive, and helpful, and particularly in these fraught times, important work. So I'm very happy we're doing it. Why don't we move on to talk about our academic programs? And Dan's been sitting patiently. I don't know if he's been sitting patiently, but he's been sitting. And Dan, why don't you do a little bit of an overview of our 3 graduate programs?
I've been sitting just engaged and enthralled by what I'm learning from my 2 colleagues. We have 3 academic programs, and they really do all touch on public policy in slightly different ways. And they really are quite complementary to each other. So we have a master's in public policy, which primarily focuses on both the development, the analysis, and the strategic communication of public policy. So it's kind of that front end of policy making, right? Advocating for policy, then developing and thinking about policy from an analytical perspective, and strategically positioning public policy so it could be effective in moving forward. Then on the flip side of that, we have the Master's of Public Administration, which really looks at the implementation of public policy. So once legislation has been passed and a policy is in place, it's those public administrators that really end up implementing that policy. Along the way of that implementation, they have hundreds of different decision points, which they're really a part of that policy-making process, but after the fact to some degree. And our students learn about managing complex organizations in that program and how you take a relatively large piece of legislation and slowly implement that through the process, both the executive branch and through nonprofit and private sector organizations as well. And then we have a program called the Masters of Community Development. And we really think of that program as more of your ground up type policymaking. It's a lot of organizing at the community level, project-based work, starting at a pretty early phase in the project design process and working that through until it's fruition. And, some of that is directly related to public policy making. And some of it is much more local and really dealing with organizing on a local level. So I think we touch on a whole bunch of different areas within that public policymaking process.
Yeah, Dan, when the programs got started and came in, it's been interesting for me to see the connections of our work to all 3 and how they're different. And your description was really I think plays out in that. And we've enjoyed having fellows from the master's programs be a part of our program, for example. So I think it's been enriching to have the programs in the Carsey School for sure.
Yeah, I mean, my take is that the beauty of having these programs in the Carsey School is it really does allow for this integration across civic engagement activities that folks like you guys at New Hampshire Listens are doing, to the research efforts that are taking place across the school, and giving students that enriching experience across those different areas is something that not all programs are able to do, and I think we're able to do that, and we do it reasonably well.
Dan, what's your favorite thing about the MPA? That's
my favorite thing about the MPA. No question, it's the students, right? Our students, I kind of walk into a class, and the most comforting thing about being in a classroom with 15 students who know more than I do on most topics is I could lean on them, right? These students are mid-career professionals. They've been at their jobs for, 15, 20 years. So we could turn to that fire chief and we could say, hey, this is the theory behind how public administration works. Tell me how it works in your organization. How does that play out? And for me, it's fusing that theory and practice in the classroom and really letting those students articulate how that theory works in practice. I think that's by far my favorite part.
Yeah, I teach in the Masters in Public Policy program, and I think I'm just excited about students who just, they're in it because they want to make a change, positive change in the world, and that's great. My favorite thing to do with the students is our trip to Washington, where we take the students in each year down to Washington, D.C., and we do about 25 meetings, with all the full swath of kind of policy and political professionals in D.C. We've had White House meetings. We go to embassies. We meet with people in the Hill, Capitol Hill. We meet with lobbyists. We meet with advocacy groups. We meet with research organizations, political consultants. And, it's great for the students because they get a full breadth exposure to the industry of policy. But I always learn things too because of the great people we meet with down there. So that's kind of my favorite. And I'd say with the Masters in Community Development, I love the annual presentation of the capstone projects because most these students are generally speaking back in their communities for a good part of the program. It's both remote and in person. And just seeing the very cool projects that they've done with the help of the faculty in their communities is really, it's very varied group of projects, and they're just really making a difference in their communities, which is fantastic. So I should probably, we're kind of getting close to time, and I should probably just kick in with a little bit more about the research component of what we do, because it's such a big part of, in fact, what the Carsey School does. And we do a lot of different kinds of things. I'm going to just highlight some areas where we are particularly national leaders. One is in demography. Our senior demographer, Ken Johnson, if you read a story that relates to demographic data in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, you're probably seeing Ken and quoted in the paper. But the thing that makes Ken remarkable is how good he is and how the people working with him are so good at identifying what's happening in demographic trends and populations growth and changes that is going to affect the demands on public policy, what's going to be happening in the future, and what's happening now with populations and how that affects what the problems are that public policy needs to address. We're also very strong in finance, and particularly the challenges of getting investment into low-income communities. There are lots of good investments that can be made in low-income communities that can help people in those communities, help them grow, help with employment in those communities. But they're good investments, but for a variety of reasons, banks and traditional financing sources don't make the investments. And we're the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, a lead partner of theirs in that work. And we work with a variety of other players and conduct a lot of research in figuring out how to get that kind of investment in. And it's both research and real implementation work. We do a lot of work, rural research work. We recently have done a couple of reports that have gotten a fair amount of attention on how COVID-19 is affecting rural communities. We do other work in related to rural issues. Do work on family support and income, so food access to childcare, how that affects the ability of people to work, the impact of various social programs. We do work, a couple of things that are very topical right now. We've, for a long time, done work on and published work on the relationship between people's views of science and politics, and how their views of science affects their behavior. Very relevant now. We've been publishing recently things particularly related to COVID-19. We do economic and fiscal work. We're doing a whole series on the economic impact state by state of COVID-19. Anyway, I could go on. We do a lot of different types of research and a lot of different kinds of activities to help inform and promote good public policy. I'd say one thing: go to the Carsey School website, which I'm sure you can find, and you'll see the full breadth of the kind of work we do. So that's all I have to say about research. Anything anyone else wants to chime in with? I think we're about at time.
Nope.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. And we'll do this again.